Hello and welcome back. New Zealand Prepper here with things you need to know now. Right, this channel is designed to let you know what's happening and what's coming up and what to do about it. It's not financial advice, nor do I advocate dissent or violence. I want you to get prepared so that we can remain peaceful here. You need to prepare for the breakdown of society, for the incoming food shortages, for what the hungry will do if you have food and they don't. The number one thing to do now, get access to food and water. When the taps don't work, when the power is not on, and when the prices are so high you cannot afford to eat, you need access to food and water. Why? Well, because hyperinflation is coming, bank runs are coming, a food shortage is currently unfolding, the supply chain is collapsing, and crime is accelerating all over our country. Right now, the poor are choosing between food or rent or fuel. This is causing crime, and this is going to accelerate and get worse. Just think, if you have ever not eaten for 3 days, how far will you go to get food on the 4th? All this domesticity we have had and to some extent have enjoyed, it is over. Watch out for yourself. Do not send your woman or your spouse to do shopping alone because thieves will wait for your trolley in the car park. If you're in one of the bigger cities, you need to know that this is going to happen quicker than in small regions and scarcely populated regions. If you are wealthy, do not display it because sooner or later they will come for what you have. Be prepared to defend yourself even at the cost of others' lives. The time to be soft is over. Get tools and think of what you're going to need if you have no power, no fuel. Do you have tools, hand tools, that will let you harvest wood, grow vegetables, or dig a bunker to keep your family safe? Right now, I know this may seem a little scary. Things do not look quite as bad as what I have described. But that only means you have a little time to get things done. If you don't, you'll wish you had done so before, and we may as well only be a few months behind what's happening in other parts of the world. So, what is happening? Where is it happening? And given that our media won't tell us, what are we going to look at, right? Firstly, Russia and Ukraine are at war, and Ukraine is doing a good job, but it is not winning. You may think this is far away, but remember, between Russia and Ukraine, they were the exporters of about a third of the world's food and grain and fuel, and that has all stopped. They're still exporting, but not to us, as our government is tied to the UN, and the UN and the UK and the US and us are classified as unfriendly countries which cannot trade with Russia. It's not hurting Russia. They have a war chest that they've developed over decades. They have the resources, and they are making sure if anyone gets any of them at all, they do pay in Russian rubles. If they don't, like Finland, Russia has just cut them off from their energy recently because they refuse to pay in rubles. Over here, not having access to those things is causing our fuel prices to rise a lot. India had a heat wave earlier this year. It greatly affected their grain supply and farm yields, and they are now put a ban on exporting those foods. America is in a historic drought. Their food production of soybeans and corn in the last 3 years has been severely reduced, and China had floods damaging their crops to a massive extent. Their response was to tell all of their citizens to stockpile 1 year worth of food. They said that, almost a year ago, because they knew that this was coming, and yet our government said nothing. They also have had massive lockdowns currently. They're still ongoing. That's making the supply chain crisis a lot worse. What else? Sri Lanka is in crisis right now. Their people cannot make enough money to eat. There's a debt crisis there, and in another 70 odd developing countries there's a massive debt crisis and they're on the verge of debt default. Iran has begun rolling out its next system of control due to hyperinflation, one that is soon going to spread everywhere, I think. It's sort of a precursor to the social credit system they have in China, where you get a score, but the score is not like a credit score, it's a personal score. It determines where you can live, what sort of work you're suited for, and it punishes you or your friends if you're openly critical of the government. Yes, if you have views of the government that are critical, your social credit score will suffer. In Iran, their hyperinflation is so bad that people cannot afford bread. The government has decided to subsidize bread and soon other essential foods, but you can only get a rationed amount of the subsidized bread if you have a biometric digital ID supplied by the government. In one of my earlier videos, I told you when you give the government power, they do not let it go. They keep it one way or the other. And I looked into this a little while ago. I saw that they haven't changed or repealed lots of the COVID restrictions. They've only updated and replaced them with new COVID framework restrictions. And now we hear that a new COVID passport is on the horizon. I wonder if you can tell me where you think this is going. We touched briefly last time I made a video like this on the CPTTA, which is the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Tasman Partnership Agreement. Its effects on us as New Zealanders are not great, but I want to illuminate one part of that. Our farmers and growers here in New Zealand are about to suffer from an amendment and review of the Plant Variety Rights Act of 1987. For us to comply with the CPTTA, to which we are bound, our farmers now, if they purchase a crop or seed for that crop and grow it successfully, if they then want to hold some back for seed next year, they will be required to pay a royalty to the original seed producer. Right? So that is essentially a bureaucratic farce that just increases the cost of farming and growing crops in New Zealand to the enrichment and profits of multinational corporations. And we wonder why farmers prefer to till crops into the ground instead of supplying in abundance in New Zealand and having cheaper foods. Not just that, of course, there are other bits to it. Let's try to be objective here, but we also need to understand that the supermarket duopoly we have is not willing to pay farmers the cost plus margin for what they grow, even though they could, and if vegetables were cheaper we would buy more and they would still make their profits and the excess could be exported. Essentially they are just trying to railroad them into selling it below cost, which of course the farmers don't want to do, right? When you legislate and create policies that hurt our growers or farmers, and when you work towards divisive policies like the travesty of the Crown Pastoral Land Reform Act and amendments I watched be implemented dictatorially last week in Parliament, you are actively working against the betterment of your own population. The Crown Pastoral Land Reform Act amendments are aimed at leasehold land that has been used to farm in the King Country regions and other regions there by farmers that have worked the land for generations. This is Crown land that has a lease to be farmed. The landowners' lease rates are exploded and the onus is on the farmers to prove they can keep paying their leases with the banks. However, the income they make from farming is not allowed to be taken into account, effectively meaning they're going to have to make money elsewhere to cover the cost of their leases. Or they'll be booted off their land, it'll go back to fallow by the government. It's a direct attack on the roughly 169 Crown lease land farmers across the country. This is the government robbing the families of the land that they have farmed for generations, ancestral leased farmland and livelihoods. It's only apparently okay as long as many of the families are non-Maori, right? This so-called co-governance stick the Labour Party is rushing through at speed while they have the power to do so is an attack on white middle-income New Zealanders. Now, I want to put out a somewhat controversial view here. Our government has failed. It has indebted us to overseas multinational corporations who are limiting us on every path. They are working towards full co-governance with Maori, and maybe that means globalization is destroyed and New Zealand is once again free to do what it wants, but so be it, right? Now, I'm a New Zealander. I want simple things. I want the right to own my own land, work for myself or companies I share values with, hunt public land and farm and grow what I can where I can without excessive oversight. I don't think that's too much. If the Maori are thus aligned, I have no issues. If, however, they try to limit the rights, including where I can hunt and voting power of white New Zealanders, I have an issue. In some parts, they have tried to say those on the Maori electoral roll should have the same say as those on the general roll. This would mean that one on the Maori roll has 3 times the voting power of, say, me, right? And I think this is unfair. I don't oppose them having an equal say, but their say should not be worth 3 times mine. I fully believe the government should be dismantled. New Zealand should break into regions, with each district like Wanganui deciding on its own agendas, and taxes should be halved and go only to the local councils. The level of bureaucracy we have is not needed, and those who live in each area should vote on what gets passed into law in their area. We should be perhaps the independent confederation of New Zealand. At this point, we have not only an ineffective government but an openly hostile government body with broad and ever-growing powers. This government has become the King John of 1215 AD in England, offering placating gestures, then killing off opponents and doing their things their own way anyway. Okay, so now we've touched on what is happening around the world a little and what has happened here. We started with what you should do and why, so let's talk about some recent things that have been in the news. At this point, the news and the budget are more of a distraction than anything else, but let's talk about this climate change distraction, right? Giving low-income New Zealanders $6,000 to $10,000 to scrap their old car and get into an electric vehicle, well, that is absurd. Why? It's simple, really. Electric vehicles are not environmentally friendly. They take lithium to create the batteries, which is being mined in poor countries, so we're just taking from the land again. We'll need to flood land over here to create more generation if we go to hydro to cover the energy generation also. And worse still, they are suggesting that we lease these cars, which is a perpetual expense without an asset. That'll make things harder for low-income families, not easier. Yesterday I was working, and during the middle of a rainstorm, this government's policies have made it possible to shut down a road in both directions with wait times of over 20 minutes so our road workers can clear a puddle on a farmer's land next to the road. I watched our Climate Minister James Shaw openly admit that the policies for climate change that we have gone into this year's budget did not come from him and were not his responsibility. But why? Because he has the audacity and has gone ahead and hired a group to consult and make recommendations so that he can use them as a scapegoat in interviews to save his political career when things he implemented are going wrong. We heard that the New Zealand Transport Authority did the same. They spent almost as much on consultants as they did on actual work. Labour's housing affordability fix. Oh wait, they made a working group for that, didn't they? Oh, they didn't fix the problem. It wasn't us. It was the fault of the working group that failed. Fuel prices. Oh, let's create a group to look into it and provide a report. Oh, the problem is our excessive taxes. Oh, here's a tiny tax relief for 3 months. You think anyone's being fooled by this? I don't think so. Labour says we need radical change, but what we're getting is consultants and working groups paid for by you, by me, by the taxpayer. We're going to ignore what they say mostly because all they tell us is our problem is our own lawmaking. This government is busy looking busy with no results and high inflation caused by excessive borrowing and spending on ideas it should have had before being in power. Right, well, yes. Let's move away from that. Well, this video will take forever, but you see where I'm going with this, right? For the record, I'm not a climate change denier. It is happening, but we've reached the tipping point in the world at large, and the powers that be are implementing their plan overtly and at a staggering pace. They are solving climate change by upending life as you know it and throwing it away, and throwing the future you work towards away, so that future no longer exists. Mankind is culling its number once again. Those who survive will be no different than the slaves of Egypt. We will be branded like cattle with the electronic food rationing passports. Meat will be a thing of the past. Your chickens need to be killed because of bird flu, and your gardens can't be grown because the right to farm will be rescinded. The world's powers have decided that climate change problems need to be addressed by lowering the world's population dramatically. Their soft long-term approach is too slow. The slowly poisoning and castrating of the human herd while putting docility chemicals into the water is working, but it's far too slow. People, now, I do not mean to scare you. I mean to help you to see what is going on around you and around the world and here at home. The only way to not be one of the cold is to look out for yourself, to keep vigilant, to question the media, to not blindly believe, and above all else to take responsibility for your own needs, because you cannot count on the government to do so. That's all for today. Like and subscribe and help me grow. New Zealand Prepper here with this week's dose of things you need to know. An honest and unique interpretation of our country and what's happening right now here and around the world.